there's a moment in a well-trained fighter's response to an incoming strike that looks to an untrained observer almost supernatural. They seem to know what's coming before it arrives, shifting their weight, raising a guard, or closing distance in a way that appears to happen before the attack has even fully developed. This isn't precognition, and it isn't simply faster reflexes in the generic sense most people imagine. It's the product of a genuinely measurable, well-documented process of neural reorganization that happens through sustained training, one that shifts the brain from a reactive mode, processing what's already happened, toward a predictive mode, anticipating what's about to happen based on subtle cues most untrained observers never consciously notice at all. I want to walk you through what the neuroscience actually says about this transformation. What's happening in the brain of an expert martial artist that isn't happening in the brain of a beginner, and what this research suggests about how training actually builds this capacity over time. Let's start with the foundational question, because I think it matters enormously for understanding everything that follows. What does anticipation actually mean neurologically, as opposed to simply fast reaction? A reactive response involves perceiving a stimulus, in this case, an opponent's strike already underway, and then initiating a corresponding motor response after that perception, meaning there's an unavoidable, physiologically fixed delay between stimulus and response, no matter how fast someone's nervous system is capable of firing. Anticipation, by contrast, involves using information available before the critical action is complete, an opponent's posture, weight shift, the earliest, barely visible portion of a movement, to predict what's coming and begin preparing or initiating a response before the action is actually finished, effectively working around the fixed reaction time delay altogether by acting on prediction rather than on completed information. Citation. This fundamental distinction between reactive processing and anticipatory processing based on early kinematic information has been established extensively in sport neuroscience research on expert perceptual cognitive skill, published in research, summarized in Nature Reviews Neuroscience. Let me bring in the specific brain network researchers have identified as central to this anticipatory capacity, because I think naming the actual anatomy makes this considerably more concrete. Research has identified something called the action observation network, a distributed system spanning the premotor cortex, the inferior parietal lobule, and the superior temporal sulcus, which becomes active both when you perform an action yourself and when you simply watch someone else perform that same action. Citation. This action observation network and its distributed anatomical components has been established extensively in cognitive neuroscience research, summarized in reviews published in Nature Reviews Neuroscience and subsequent sport neuroscience literature. Within this broader network sits a specific class of neurons called mirror neurons, originally discovered in the premotor cortex of macaque monkeys, which fire both when an individual executes a specific motor action and when that same individual merely observes another individual performing that identical or similar action. Citation, this mirror neuron system, originally identified in premotor area F5 of the macaque monkey, has become foundational to modern understanding of action, observation, and prediction, described extensively in neuroscience literature on motor cognition. I want to spend real time on what this actually means practically, because I think it's genuinely the crux of why martial arts training produces this specific transformation. If your brain contains neurons that fire in a shared, overlapping way, whether you're performing a specific strike yourself or watching an opponent begin that same strike, then extensive practice performing a given technique doesn't just build your capacity to execute that technique, it simultaneously builds and refines the exact same neural machinery responsible for recognizing and predicting that technique when you see someone else beginning to perform it, essentially creating a kind of internal simulation model that runs automatically the instant you perceive the earliest visual cues of a familiar movement pattern. Citation, this dual function of the mirror neuron system, supporting both action execution and action prediction through internal motor simulation, has been examined extensively in research on expertise and anticipation in sport, published in reviews in the Journal of Sport and Exercise Psychology and related motor cognition literature. Let me bring in the actual comparative research examining trained athletes against novices directly, because I think seeing the measured, quantified difference matters more than simply accepting the theoretical mechanism. Research comparing expert and novice performers across a range of combat and ball sports has consistently found that experts can predict the direction or outcome of an opponent's action considerably earlier in that action's unfolding sequence than novices can, sometimes accurately predicting outcomes based on kinematic information available well before the decisive moment of contact, information that novices simply cannot yet use predictively. Even when they're shown the exact same video footage, citation, this consistent finding of superior early-stage predictive accuracy in expert athletes compared to novices based on identical kinematic information has been demonstrated across research summarized in systematic reviews on neurophysiology of action anticipation in athletes, published in journals including Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews. I want to bring in a specific, genuinely well-designed study here that I think illustrates this with particular clarity. Research examining expert and novice volleyball players found that when shown video footage of an opponent's spike that was cut off at progressively earlier points before the actual moment of contact, experts significantly outperformed novices, specifically under the medium information condition, where the footage was cut off well before contact, correctly predicting the direction of the spike 68% of the time compared to just 55% for novices, while also reacting considerably faster, citation. This research comparing expert and novice volleyball players' predictive accuracy and reaction time under progressively restricted kinematic information conditions was published in Brain Sciences. This is a genuinely precise, quantified demonstration of exactly what we mean by a shift from reaction to anticipation. The experts weren't simply faster at responding once the full action was visible. They were extracting genuinely useful, action-relevant information from an earlier, more ambiguous portion of the movement that novices watching the identical footage simply couldn't yet decode. Let me address the specific electrophysiological signature underlying this capacity, since I think this adds genuinely important mechanistic precision beyond the behavioral, outcome-based research we've discussed so far. Researchers using EEG to measure brain activity during these anticipation tasks have identified something called mu rhythm suppression, a specific pattern of reduced electrical activity over sensory motor brain regions that occurs when the motor system is actively engaged in simulating or preparing a movement, and research has found that experts show significantly greater mu rhythm desynchronization, meaning stronger evidence of active motor simulation, during the specific window immediately preceding contact in an anticipation task compared to novices, and that this desynchronization correlates directly with prediction accuracy, citation. This research examining mu rhythm desynchronization as a specific electrophysiological marker of motor simulation during action anticipation and its correlation with prediction accuracy in expert athletes was published in research on volleyball spike anticipation in Brain Sciences. This gives us genuinely direct, measurable evidence that experts aren't simply guessing better based on some vague, unexplainable intuition. Their motor cortex is measurably, actively simulating the observed action in real time, using that internal simulation as a genuine predictive model. Let me bring in something about alpha rhythm activity here as well, since it represents a complementary and I think genuinely interesting additional piece of this electrophysiological picture. Beyond mu suppression specifically related to motor simulation, research has found that experts show distinctive patterns of alpha rhythm desynchronization reflecting heightened attentional engagement, with experts showing their strongest attentional engagement specifically during the most information-scarce, most ambiguous portion of an observed action, precisely when accurate prediction is most difficult and therefore most valuable, while novices show their attentional peak later, closer to the moment the action becomes unambiguous and therefore, from a predictive standpoint, considerably less useful. Citation, this differential pattern of attentional engagement measured through alpha rhythm desynchronization between experts and novices across different levels of available kinematic information has been examined in research published in Brain Sciences. This is genuinely important. It suggests experts have learned through extensive training to actively direct their most concentrated attention toward exactly the earliest, most ambiguous window of an opponent's movement, precisely the window containing the subtle cues that make genuine anticipation possible, rather than passively waiting for the action to become fully, unambiguously clear. Let me address the cerebellum's role in this process here as well, since I think this represents a genuinely important, somewhat less commonly discussed piece of this broader network. Research examining expert athletes across different sports, comparing tennis experts, anticipating tennis serves against volleyball experts, anticipating volleyball serves, with each group serving as relative novices in the other's specific sport, found that cerebellar activation during anticipation tasks was considerably stronger, specifically in each group's area of expertise, with the magnitude of cerebellar activation correlating directly with anticipation, accuracy, citation, Balser and colleagues. This research demonstrating sport-specific cerebellar activation during action anticipation correlated directly with prediction accuracy was published in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience. This connects to something we touched on in a previous video regarding the cerebellum's surprising involvement in the freeze response circuit and reinforces a broader theme worth naming directly. The cerebellum, historically understood almost purely as a structure for fine motor coordination and balance, is increasingly recognized across multiple distinct lines of neuroscience research as playing a genuinely important role in prediction and timing more broadly, including the specific sport-relevant predictive capacity we're discussing throughout this entire video. I want to bring in something about neural efficiency here now, since I think this represents a genuinely important and somewhat counterintuitive piece of the overall expertise research. You might reasonably assume that expert performers show simply more brain activation than novices across the board, given how much more sophisticated their perceptual and predictive processing clearly is. But research examining what's called the neural efficiency hypothesis has actually found the opposite pattern in many contexts. Expert performers, including elite shooters, fencers, and karate practitioners specifically, often show reduced, more focused brain activation during task-relevant processing compared to novices, reflecting a more efficient, more specialized neural recruitment pattern that accomplishes the same or superior cognitive work using considerably less overall neural resource expenditure. Citation, this neural efficiency hypothesis, and its documentation specifically in elite shooters, fencers, and karate practitioners has been examined extensively in systematic review research published in Frontiers in Behavioral Neuroscience. I think this is genuinely important context. Extensive martial arts training doesn't simply add more processing power in some brute force sense. It appears to genuinely refine and streamline the specific neural circuitry involved, producing a system that accomplishes considerably more sophisticated predictive work using a more targeted, efficient pattern of activation, which likely also explains part of why experienced practitioners can sustain this level of perceptual sophistication over the duration of an extended sparring match or bout without the same degree of cognitive fatigue a novice attempting equivalent analysis would experience. Let me bring in something specifically about martial arts research, distinct from the ball sport research we've drawn on heavily so far, since I think it's worth grounding this conversation directly in combat sport-specific findings rather than extrapolating purely from research on tennis, volleyball, and basketball. Research specifically comparing skilled and novice martial arts athletes using event-related potentials. A specific EEG measurement technique capturing brain responses time-locked to a particular stimulus during a sustained attention task found that skilled martial artists showed distinctive patterns of brain electrical activity reflecting superior sustained attentional capacity, even during a task entirely unrelated to martial arts itself, suggesting that the specific combat-relevant demand for prolonged, focused attention during sparring produces measurable, transferable improvements in general attentional capacity, not simply narrow, sport-specific pattern recognition alone. Citation, Sanchez-Lopez and colleagues. This research comparing skilled and novice martial arts athletes on a sustained attention task using event-related potentials was published in PeerJ. This is genuinely important because it suggests the neural changes we've discussed throughout this video extend beyond simply improved recognition of specific striking or grappling patterns. Martial arts training appears to build a genuinely more robust, more sustained capacity for focused attention itself, a cognitive resource with relevance well beyond the specific context of combat sports. Let me address something about deception and how experts handle it, since I think this adds genuinely important nuance to what could otherwise sound like an unambiguously, straightforwardly positive story about expert anticipation. Research has found that expert performers' heavy reliance on kinematic cues, the specific learned patterns of movement associated with particular techniques, can actually make them somewhat more susceptible to deception under certain conditions than less experienced observers who rely less heavily on this specific kind of pattern recognition citation to Mayo and colleagues. This research demonstrating that expert athletes' reliance on kinematic cues can increase vulnerability to certain deceptive actions has been published in Cerebral Cortex in a widely cited study examining fake action detection in soccer players and goalkeepers specifically. I think this is genuinely important, honest context because it directly connects to why deceptive techniques, feints, fakes, misdirection remain such a genuinely effective, enduring tactic, even against highly skilled, experienced opponents in essentially every combat sport and martial art. An expert's predictive model is built on genuine, learned statistical regularities in how movements typically unfold, and a well-executed feint specifically deliberately exploits that learned model by presenting the early kinematic signature of one action before actually executing a different one, essentially hacking the very predictive machinery that otherwise gives experts their advantage. Let me bring in something about how this predictive capacity interacts with time pressure specifically, since I think this connects usefully to the actual high-speed reality of live combat sparring, rather than the more controlled, deliberate-paced research conditions we've discussed so far. Research examining expert basketball players under artificially imposed time constraints found that while time pressure did measurably reduce overall prediction accuracy for everyone, experts specifically maintained their capacity to strategically incorporate prior contextual information, meaning what they already knew about a given opponent's tendencies or the situational context of the play, into their predictions even under severe time pressure, with EEG data showing increased parietal alpha synchronization and enhanced motor simulation, specifically when time was limited, suggesting a genuine adaptive shift toward more top-down, expectation-driven prediction strategies precisely when the available bottom-up, purely visual information became too limited to rely on alone citation. This research on expert basketball players maintaining strategic use of prior information under severe time constraints with corresponding EEG evidence of increased top-down predictive engagement was published in Cognitive Research, Principles and Implications. I find this genuinely compelling. It suggests that expert anticipation isn't simply a single fixed skill. It's a flexible, adaptive system capable of dynamically shifting its reliance between direct visual information and learned contextual prior knowledge, depending on how much time and visual information is actually available in a given moment. Precisely the kind of adaptive flexibility a real chaotic sparring or combat situation demands. Let me address something about procedural memory and its role in this entire process, since I think it deserves more direct explanation given how much we've referenced learned patterns and internal models without fully unpacking what that specifically means. Procedural memory refers to a distinct memory system responsible for skills and habits that become automatic through repetition, riding a bicycle being the classic example, operating largely outside conscious, deliberate recall. And research suggests that a martial artist's capacity to instantly recognize and predict a specific striking or grappling pattern draws heavily on exactly this procedural memory system, built through the countless repetitions involved in drilling techniques, meaning the recognition and prediction process itself becomes considerably faster and more automatic than anything achievable through purely conscious, deliberate analysis of an opponent's movement, citation, this role of procedural memory in supporting rapid largely automatic recognition and prediction of familiar movement patterns in expert athletes has been discussed in research on the neuroscience of anticipatory excellence in sport, published in reviews in neuroscience and biobehavioral reviews. This connects directly to something worth emphasizing, given how this entire video has been framed around neural rewiring. Specifically, the transition from reaction to anticipation isn't simply a matter of consciously learning to watch more carefully. It reflects a genuine structural shift in which memory and processing systems are handling the relevant information, moving from slower, effortful, consciously mediated analysis toward faster, largely automatic, procedurally mediated pattern recognition. I want to bring in something about the role of actually performing a movement, not just watching it, in building this predictive capacity, since I think this offers genuinely important practical guidance connecting directly back to actual training methodology. Research examining expert cricket batters found that their predictive accuracy for the direction of an incoming ball actually improved further when they were allowed to hold and swing a bat while making their prediction, essentially engaging their own motor system during the prediction task itself, while novice players showed no corresponding improvement from being given a bat to hold a citation. This research demonstrating that engaging one's own motor system during a prediction task specifically enhances predictive accuracy in expert, but not novice athletes has been discussed in research on the neuroscience of sport performance, examining mirror neuron involvement in expert anticipation. This is genuinely useful, practical evidence directly supporting something a lot of experienced martial arts instructors likely already intuit without necessarily having the specific neuroscience to explain why. Actually practicing a technique yourself repeatedly through your own body builds a considerably more powerful predictive capacity for recognizing that same technique in an opponent than passive observation alone ever could, precisely because it's your own motor system's engagement, drawing on the shared overlapping mirror neuron circuitry we discussed earlier, that provides the genuine predictive advantage. Let me address the specific integrated brain network research has found in athletes combining both motor imagery, mentally rehearsing a movement without physically executing it, and action anticipation, predicting an opponent's movement, since I think this represents a genuinely sophisticated, more complete picture of what long-term training actually builds. A recent meta-analysis specifically examining brain activation across both motor imagery and action anticipation tasks in athletes found that athletes, unlike non-athletes, showed a cohesive, integrated frontoparietal temporal network supporting both processes together, suggesting that extensive training doesn't simply build two separate skills side by side. Mentally rehearsing your own techniques and predicting an opponent's movements, it appears to genuinely integrate these into a single, unified neural system that supports both internally generated and externally observed action processing simultaneously. Citation, Wang and colleagues. This meta-analysis identifying an integrated frontoparietal temporal network supporting both motor imagery and action anticipation, specifically in athletes, absent in non-athletes, was published in Frontiers in Sports and Active Living. This offers a genuinely compelling, unifying picture to close out the core neuroscience portion of this video. Sustained martial arts training doesn't simply sharpen a narrow, isolated perceptual skill. It appears to construct a genuinely integrated, efficient neural architecture where your own capacity to perform a technique and your capacity to predict that same technique in an opponent become two expressions of a single shared underlying system, precisely the kind of deep structural rewiring, the framing of this entire video has been built around. Let me bring this entire considerably long conversation together now into what I actually want you to walk away with. The transition from reaction to anticipation that experienced martial artists demonstrate isn't mystical, and it isn't simply a matter of generically faster reflexes. It's a genuinely well-documented, mechanistically understood product of the action observation network and mirror neuron system, built and refined through the specific, repeated combination of performing techniques yourself and observing them performed by others, producing measurable changes in cerebellar engagement, attentional deployment patterns captured through alpha and mu rhythm activity, and an increasingly efficient integrated neural architecture that requires less overall processing effort to accomplish considerably more sophisticated predictive work than an untrained brain can manage. This capacity remains genuinely vulnerable to deception, precisely because it's built on learned statistical patterns that can be deliberately exploited, and it appears to draw on a flexible, adaptive system capable of shifting between direct visual information and learned contextual expectation depending on how much time, genuinely stressful. Live combat allows for either, let me add considerably more depth here, drawing on additional research threads that deserve fuller treatment. I want to go deeper into the specific role of the superior parietal lobule, since I mentioned it briefly in the tennis and volleyball cerebellum research, but haven't fully explained what this region actually does within the broader anticipation network. The superior parietal lobule is centrally involved in integrating visual spatial information with planned or predicted motor responses, essentially serving as a kind of coordinate mapping hub that translates, here's where I'm seeing movement happening in space, into here's where my own body needs to be positioned in response. And research has found that activation within this specific region scales directly with the degree of task-specific expertise, meaning the more specialized experience someone has with a specific sport or combat discipline, the more strongly this region activates during anticipation of movements specific to that discipline. Citation, this role of the superior parietal lobule in integrating spatial visual information with predicted motor response and its expertise-dependent activation has been examined in research on tennis and volleyball expert anticipation, published in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience. This adds genuinely useful anatomical precision to the broader action observation network we discussed earlier. It's not simply that experts recognize a pattern faster. This specific brain region appears to be doing the genuinely complex work of mapping observed opponent movement directly onto a spatial framework relevant to the observer's own body and its potential responses, a considerably more sophisticated computational task than pattern recognition alone. Let me bring in something about the enteric nervous system and interoception here as well, since this represents a genuinely fascinating, if more speculative, frontier of this research that I think deserves inclusion given how directly it connects to something practitioners of many martial arts traditions describe subjectively, often called intuition or a feeling for an opponent's next move. Some researchers have proposed that predictive coding, a broader theoretical framework in neuroscience, describing the brain as constantly generating predictions about incoming sensory information and updating those predictions based on prediction errors, extends beyond purely external visual anticipation into interoception, your brain's ongoing awareness of internal bodily states, and have suggested that expert athletes' subjective reports of gut feelings or intuitive anticipation may reflect genuine, if not fully consciously accessible, integration of interoceptive signals alongside the visual and motor simulation processes we've discussed throughout this video. Citation, this theoretical proposal connecting predictive coding, interoception, and the enteric nervous system to expert intuitive anticipation in sport has been discussed in research published in Progress in Brain Research. I want to be genuinely careful and honest about the current state of this specific line of research. It remains considerably more theoretical and less directly experimentally validated compared to the mirror neuron and action observation network research we've discussed extensively throughout most of this video. But I think it's worth including because it offers a genuinely compelling, scientifically grounded framework for understanding something that martial artists across many different traditions and cultures have described subjectively for centuries without previously having any mechanistic neuroscience to explain it. I want to spend real time now on the specific relationship between training history and position-specific or role-specific anticipatory expertise, since I think this adds genuinely important practical nuance to how transferable this predictive capacity actually is. Research examining soccer players' capacity to predict teammates' and opponents' movements found that both general playing expertise and position-specific experience independently contributed to prediction. Accuracy, with players showing their highest predictive accuracy specifically when anticipating actions that aligned with their own particular position's typical demands and movement patterns. Citation, this research, demonstrating that both general expertise and position-specific training history independently shape prediction accuracy, with the strongest effects for actions matching one's own specific playing role, was published in scientific reports. This is genuinely important, practical context that I think extends meaningfully to martial arts and combat sports specifically. It suggests that the predictive expertise we've discussed throughout this video isn't a single generic skill that transfers uniformly across every possible technique or scenario. It's considerably more specific and specialized than that. Someone with extensive experience, specifically in striking arts, likely develops a genuinely more refined predictive capacity for striking-based attacks, specifically compared to their capacity to anticipate a grappling-based takedown attempt, even if both fall broadly under the same overall category of combat sports experience. Let me address something about the specific training methodologies that have been directly tested for their effectiveness at building this anticipatory capacity, since I think this represents the most genuinely practical, actionable piece of this entire conversation. Research has specifically examined whether video-based perceptual training, where athletes repeatedly practice predicting outcomes from video footage of an opponent's movement without any actual physical execution involved, can meaningfully improve real-world anticipatory performance, and results across this body of research have been genuinely mixed, with some studies finding meaningful transfer to actual live performance, while others have found that improvements on the specific video-based training task don't reliably generalize to genuine physically embodied performance in live competition or sparring citation. This mixed evidence regarding the transferability of purely video-based perceptual training to genuine live sport performance has been discussed in narrative reviews on neuroergonomics and perceptual cognitive skill training in sport, published in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience. I think this connects directly and usefully to the cricket batting research we discussed earlier, where actually holding and swinging a bat during the prediction task specifically improved expert performance in a way that passive observation alone didn't, reinforcing a genuinely important practical principle. The most effective training for building this anticipatory capacity appears to specifically require your own motor system to be genuinely engaged during the prediction and observation process, not purely passive, disembodied video analysis performed while sitting still. Let me bring in something about the developmental timeline for building this kind of expertise, since I think this deserves genuine, honest treatment, given how often popular content oversimplifies the 10,000 hours narrative around expertise development. Research on perceptual cognitive expertise development across sport, military, and medical domains has generally found that meaningful anticipatory expertise requires extensive, sustained deliberate practice over a period of years, not weeks or months, with the specific timeline varying considerably depending on the complexity of the domain and the intensity and quality of training received. Citation: this general timeline requirement for developing genuine perceptual cognitive expertise across sport, military, and medical high-performance domains has been discussed in narrative review research on expertise development published in Research examining perceptual cognitive skill acquisition. I want to be honest about something else worth naming here. Research has also found that the specific quality and structure of practice matters considerably, not simply the total accumulated hours, with training that specifically incorporates variable, realistic, opponent-responsive practice. Sparring against genuinely resisting opponents under conditions that closely mirror actual competition appears to build this anticipatory capacity considerably more effectively than repetitive, purely choreographed drilling against a compliant, predictable partner, connecting directly back to the specificity principle we discussed earlier regarding position-specific and role-specific expertise. Let me address something about age and the trainability of this specific anticipatory capacity here as well, since I think this connects usefully to broader themes we've explored across other videos regarding neuroplasticity and learning capacity across the lifespan. While the bulk of the research we've discussed throughout this video has been conducted in relatively young, already elite athlete populations, Research on general motor learning and skill acquisition across the adult lifespan has generally found that while the specific rate of skill acquisition may slow somewhat with age, meaningful improvement in perceptual motor prediction tasks remains genuinely achievable well into middle age and beyond, particularly when training is structured appropriately and practiced consistently, citation. This general finding regarding continued capacity for perceptual motor skill acquisition across the adult lifespan, albeit at a somewhat different rate than in younger individuals, has been discussed in motor learning and skill acquisition research across the lifespan. This is genuinely encouraging context for anyone beginning martial arts training later in life, wondering whether the kind of neural reorganization we've discussed throughout this entire video remains genuinely available to them. The underlying neuroplasticity mechanisms supporting this kind of learning don't simply disappear at some fixed age cutoff, though building this expertise later in life will likely require the same genuine, sustained, appropriately structured practice that younger practitioners require, rather than happening more slowly or effortlessly through some kind of shortcut. I want to bring in something about combat sports specifically and injury risk in relation to this predictive capacity, since I think this offers a genuinely practical, safety-relevant application of everything we've discussed throughout this video. Some research examining concussion and head injury risk in combat sports has suggested that superior anticipatory capacity, specifically the ability to predict an incoming strike earlier and initiate protective or evasive responses before that strike is fully underway, may itself function as a genuine protective factor against injury beyond simply improving competitive performance, since earlier detection and response allows more time to reduce the force of an impact or avoid it entirely, compared to a purely reactive response initiated only after a strike is already substantially underway. Citation needed for dedicated, large-scale research specifically quantifying the direct relationship between measured anticipatory capacity and reduced injury or concussion incidents in combat sports athletes, since this represents a plausible, mechanistically consistent extension of the broader anticipation research we've discussed throughout this video, rather than a distinctly established, separately validated finding in its own right. I think this is a genuinely important practical dimension worth including, even with this appropriate caveat, since it reframes the entire developmental process we've discussed throughout this video as carrying safety relevance well beyond simply competitive advantage. Let me talk about how this entire body of research connects to coaching and training design more directly now, since I think this represents genuinely useful, practical guidance for anyone actually involved in martial arts instruction or training program design. Given everything we've discussed regarding the specific value of engaging one's own motor system during prediction tasks, the importance of realistic, variable, opponent-responsive practice over repetitive, choreographed drilling, and the position or role-specific nature of expertise transfer, training approaches that deliberately incorporate live, resisting sparring partners, that vary attack patterns and timing rather than relying purely on predictable, choreographed sequences, and that specifically emphasize recognizing and responding to the earliest, most subtle cues of an opponent's movement, rather than waiting for a technique to become fully, unambiguously clear, appear most directly aligned with what this body of neuroscience research suggests, actually builds genuine anticipatory expertise, as opposed to simply building faster reaction to already completed movements, citation. These specific training design principles, drawn directly from the broader research on perceptual cognitive expertise development we've discussed throughout this video, have been discussed in applied sports science literature on training design for anticipatory skill development. Let me bring this considerably expanded, thorough conversation to its actual final close now. Everything we've added in this deeper exploration, the superior parietal lobule's specific role in mapping observed movement onto one's own spatial and motor framework, the genuinely fascinating, if more speculative, connection to interoception and predictive coding that may underlie subjective reports of combat intuition, the position and role-specific nature of anticipatory expertise transfer, the mixed evidence on purely video-based perceptual training, and the specific value of motor engagement during prediction practice, honest acknowledgement of the genuine time and practice quality required to build this expertise, the continued availability of this kind of neuroplastic learning across the adult lifespan, and the plausible, safety-relevant connection between anticipatory capacity and reduced injury risk. All of it reinforces and deepens the central message this entire video has been built around. The transformation from reaction to anticipation that defines expert martial arts performance is a genuine, measurable, mechanistically well-characterized product of sustained, appropriately structured training, engaging the shared circuitry between performing and observing action. And it represents one of the more genuinely compelling demonstrations available anywhere in neuroscience of how deliberate, sustained practice doesn't just make you better at a specific task, it fundamentally reorganizes how your brain processes and predicts the world around you. This video discusses general neuroscience and sports science research for informational and educational purposes only. If you're pursuing martial arts training specifically for self-defense, competitive combat sports, or general fitness, please seek instruction from a qualified, appropriately credentialed instructor to ensure proper technique and safety, particularly given the genuine physical risks involved in combat sports training.